We'll begin with prayer. And specifically, you might think, I'm pretty sure some of you, when you saw the topic, you're kind of like, okay, where is that coming from? But this month, we celebrate two feasts that are about barrenness. You've got the birth of Mary, the birthday of Mary. And that one is coming through, of course, Joachim and Anna, who in their own earlier history prior to Mary, they were barren and they suffered through it. And then the end of the month, the 23rd of September, so we celebrate the Feast of the Conception of St. John the Baptist, who is also, again, Elizabeth and Zachariah, who couldn't have a child. And, in looking at where we would start this session of webinars, I thought, okay, that seems to be kind of something important because it happens a few times in the New Testament. And the references point us back to the Old Testament. So it's a big deal there too. And so I thought, well, it might be a good idea to take a look at how this topic is, because that also can help us, as most of you know, today that's a topic too. Because there are many couples who are trying to have children and they're not being successful about it. And so this is not something that is completely removed from our reality. And so we're going to start with the prayer before I really get going. We're going to start with the prayer are the liturgical hymns, first for the Nativity of Mary, and then for the conception of John the Baptist. And so listen to the words, because there are some very, I would say, hard-hitting words that really reveal a little bit, not only about the plan of God, but also about the perception of man, how we looked at these things. So, in the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit. Amen. Your birth, O Virgin Theotokos, heralded joy to the universe. For from you arose the Son of Justice, Christ our God. Removing the curse, he gave the blessing, and by destroying death, he granted us eternal life. At your holy birth, O Immaculate One, Joachim and Anna were freed from the reproach of childlessness, and Adam and Eve from the corruption of death. Your people, delivered from the guilt of their faults, celebrate your birth and cry out, the barren woman gives birth to the Theotokos and sustainer of our life. Glory to the Father, and to the Son, and to the Holy Spirit, now and ever and forever. Amen. Joy to you, O barren one, unable to give birth. Behold, you conceive today the one who is really a torch of the sun, who will enlighten the whole world that suffers from blindness. Rejoice, O Zachariah, and cry out in all confidence. The one who will be born is a prophet of the Most High. Zachariah rejoices greatly with his wife Elizabeth, for she has conceived John the forerunner, whom the angel announced in gladness. As for us, we honor him in witness of this blessing. In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit. Amen. So you hear a little bit, there are a few things in here that give us an idea of what the biblical understanding of barrenness or childlessness is. It's a curse. Then it seems, this is the other thing, I don't know if you notice this too, but it seems to be a little bit more on the woman. there is kind of an understanding that this has to do, if there is barrenness, it's on the woman. And then when, of course, when the opposite happens, um, so in justice, they do actually give credit to the woman a little bit more, because it says, for Elizabeth has conceived, instead of, like, today we would say, well, the couple, you say they both are having the child. So there's a little bit of a mindset that we see hidden there. The other reason that I also thought it would be very nice to look at this topic in a little bit more of a biblical sense is also because I don't know how many of you are aware, but last Sunday there was an entire family that was beatified in Poland, and that was a very interesting circumstance and situation, because nothing like that has ever happened. Now, there are many parents with their adult children who are beatified and even canonized. There are a number of those. There are a number of mother and child who are also beatified or canonized. So it's not the most unusual construct. What makes this unique is that this couple that had 6 children already, so the 7th child was in the womb, and so that child was not baptized technically, which is like one of the requirements in order to be beatified or canonized. And so it comes as a recognition of both the parents' intention to baptize the child, and that the child was martyred, because essentially so the circumstances, for those of you who don't know about it, but this occurred during World War II in 1944. A couple with a big family who were living in a small village that had like 400 inhabitants. So they were very much aware of what was going on in their country, and that the country was under the Nazis, and there were certain laws there which were being enforced, and specifically that the local population would turn over any Jewish inhabitants. And one of the reasons was because Poland had one of the largest Jewish populations in all of Europe at that time. And but the other thing that the Nazis didn't count on was that the Poles would be very resistant to collaborating with the Nazis. And Jews in Poland were, for all intents and purposes, Polish. They were local. They were people that had lived there for hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of years. So they were part of the fabric and culture, and they were friends and neighbors. It wasn't some segregated group that lived, away from the normal, regular, everyday life of Poles living in Poland. They were Poles. And so this family was a family that was well known for being very Bible-based in a very literal way. One of the relics that is held in of the Alma family in their village is their family Bible. And the Bible is completely marked up and written up and highlighted and underlined, because that is how they read the Bible. They read it and studied it and used it. So the book is has signs of that wear and tear. It's not just something that was displayed in a prominent position in their home. And it was this reading of the Bible that convinced them that they needed to help those in their village and in their region who needed assistance. And so they decided to take into their home eight Jewish Poles and hide them. And so, but unfortunately, there were some people who were trying to get in good with the Germans, and so somebody ratted them out. And so on March 24th, 1944, before even the sun rose, the Nazi police came to their home and raided their house, took the 8 Jews outside and shot them dead, and then collected the entire family, which included children who were the oldest, I believe, was 7. The youngest was 1. Collected all the children as well as the parents and the mother who was pregnant in her 8th month, and they executed them outside, one at a time. And then they burned their home down and they buried them. And a week later, when the police had left, so some of the family and friends came and they disinterred the bodies so that they could give them a proper burial in the village cemetery. And that was when they discovered that the child that was in the womb had actually been born. But at that point, the mother was already deceased. And the child probably didn't survive. I mean, they're not even sure if the child was alive at that point. But nonetheless, because of this happened, it wasn't just a political thing. It wasn't just, Nazis being Nazis, but this particular group of Nazi police were well known because they repudiated Christianity. And so there were, the one who was the leader was of German background, and he had repudiated his own Protestant Christian background. And this group, because they, ultimately these executioner posses, they kind of had their own lingo and their own symbolism, that they use like on their uniforms. And they were using on their uniforms demonic symbols. And that was a popular thing that was going on in Nazi military circles because they, obviously Christianity is at odds with Nazi ideology. And so some of the military elite became kind of infatuated with almost a demonic spirituality, if you could call it that. And so there was, one of the factors when it comes to martyrdom, it's not that you're martyred as a, because of the political situation necessarily. There has to be some hatred for the faith. And that with this group of Nazi police, that was evident. It was something that was known, and it is something that was also documented. So, because one of the last soldiers involved, or policemen involved, this was the Nazi SS. One of the last ones involved with it died in 1990. And so a lot of this information was collected yet from people who had participated in the massacre and, later on had confess, more or less, to what they had done. So, but that's even though that is a very sad part of our history, what is very important is that today that beatification is a very important affirmation of family life, of holiness that takes place within the family, and a holiness that ultimately seeks to love more perfectly. And that is really what the Ulma family tried to do. That in the midst of that hatred during World War II, they tried to love by taking in those that were being persecuted. And so, and this is the reality when we look and we read about these families, such as Joachim and Anna, when we read about Elizabeth and Zachariah, but when we read about other families too, especially in the Old Testament. So this notion of barrenness, which is basically the inability of a man and woman to procreate, to have a child. So it kind of flows out of you could say, so where does the negativity come? Because, some people can have children, some people can't have children, some people decide to have children, some people decide to not have children. It's all fair. But where does the negativity come from? Because, that's kind of looking at it biblically. So then what did God say or do? Well, we can start really by reading from Genesis, the first book of Genesis, the first chapter of Genesis. And we read about the creation of man and woman. So God made man. In the image of God, he made him. Male and female, he made them. Then God blessed them, and God said to them, be fruitful and multiply. Fill the earth and subdue it, and have dominion over the fish of the sea, over the birds of the heaven, and over every living thing that moves on the earth. So this is, among the very first words that God utters in the biblical tradition. It is part of the creation epic. It sets the tone for what we could say is a Judeo-Christian worldview. And so having children is an essential part of following the command of God, because God himself said that. But then it was emphasized also throughout the Old Testament. Isaiah states that the world was created to be lived in, to be inhabited. And then we read in Deuteronomy, God's blessings bestowed on Israel always included having children. And also, God's blessings meant the absence of barrenness, as is said in Exodus and Deuteronomy. In Psalm, we read, children are the greatest blessing, a heritage of the Lord. Your wife shall be as a fruitful vine, your children like olive branches. So there is this very clear idea that having children is part and parcel of that relationship with God. And we also know that even in very dire circumstances, having children was still God's way of showing that he was with his people. And we can specifically glean that from the story of Exodus. One of the big gripes of the Egyptian overlords, and in Egypt, the Jews were not slaves completely. I mean, they were kind of under a benevolent dictator, you could say. However, they were still being mistreated. They were cheap labor, but they were essentially uh, free. Kind of sounds familiar to some of the stuff going on in our world today. But one of the issues that the Egyptians noted, and this was one of the big complaints they had, was that Hebrew women were sturdy and they had a lot of kids. And that became worrisome because the Egyptians were not having as many children. And one of the interpretations that we find in the Midrash, which are the interpretations of Jewish scriptures by Jewish rabbis and scholars, one of the interpretations that we have for these many children that the Hebrew women are having is that God blessed them with multiple kids. So it was not just, one kid at a time, but it was like double or triple. And so it was a way that God continued to show his favor upon his people Israel, even though they were enslaved. They were not free, essentially. They did not have their own country and home. They were not the rulers over their own destiny. So even under those circumstances, having children was something of a blessing. Now, in the Old Testament, though, we do see a number of women who have struggles with infertility. And I'm only saying women because that is the way that it is said in the Old Testament. So that's how it seems, but that also has to do perhaps with the understanding that they had, thousands of years ago about infertility itself. And so they didn't realize that it could also be dependent on the husband, the father to be. But these women are pointed out in the tradition of the Old Testament in very prominent ways. It was socially important to have children because the children would take care of the mother. It was kind of taken for granted that the father would die younger. And so the mother would survive and she would be taken care of by her children. Then the mother was also the matriarch. And within Judaism, there is a long-standing tradition of matriarchy within family structures. After all, even Jewish identity is transmitted through the mother. If one wants to be or wants to have Jewish ascendancy or wants to claim it, they need to be the child of a Jewish mother. And so because of those realities, the lack of children, or as is said, barrenness, meant that some of those social constructs were not exactly clear. And then, of course, came the question, well, if you are unable to obey the law of God when he said those very first words, be fruitful and multiply, so then if you can't do that, then that must be a curse. Because having children is a blessing, not having children is a curse. And so it's a kind of an interesting logic that happens there. But, we do hear it echoed over and over again even in the words of some of these women, Rachel, for example, who is the wife of Jacob. So she famously utters these words, "Give me children, or else I shall die." And so they're words which betray a great deal of emotional duress and suffering on the part of Rachel. But we'll look at her story also. Then there is also a rabbinic story that is preserved in Jewish scriptural writing, so not in the Old Testament itself, but it talks about King Hezekiah, who decided not to have children because he knew he would have bad children. So he preemptively thought, well, let's just evit that problem. And so Isaiah came after him and scolded him and said, "What have you to do with the secrets of the All-Merciful? Do your duty and let God do what it pleases him." So he got yelled at by the prophet. But still tells you a little bit about just the importance of this idea. Now, one of the things that to also, I think, to look at, which is it reveals to us in a more mature Israel, so not at the time of Abraham and Sarah, but at the time of Isaiah, it reveals to us a little bit of what the understanding of childlessness is. And this is Isaiah, who is saying that the childless woman is Israel. And he's making the accusation that Israel is barren in good works and virtue and deeds. Now, and Isaiah also called Israel the unfaithful bride. So, I mean, he had a lot of choice words for the people of Israel in his trying to, I guess, insult them back to God. But his words were very strong. But this is very interestingly worded, because here, this is more of an exhortation. And this, I think, is the cornerstone of like a biblical understanding of childlessness. That it does not mean it is necessarily a curse, but God, who decides who has children and decides who does not have children, always has a plan. And so this is kind of the theme. So it's not, all of this cultural stuff that came about reproach and, the curse and the stuff that we've been saying and that I prayed in the hymns of the feast. A lot of that is more human than divine. Isaiah here has something to tell us that reveals what the mindset of God is. So this begins in chapter 54. Be glad, O barren woman, who does not bear. Break forth and cry out, you who are not in travail. For more are the children of the desolate than the children of the married woman, says the Lord. Enlarge the place of your tent and courtyard, set it up, do not avoid it. Lengthen your ropes and strengthen your pegs. Spread out further to the right and the left, and your seed shall inherit the Gentiles. You shall cause the desolate cities to be inhabited. Fear not that you were shamed, neither be confounded and disgraced. For you will forget your former shame and will not remember the disgrace of your widowhood. For it is the Lord who is your maker, the Lord of hosts is his name. He is your deliverer, and he shall be called the God of Israel by all the earth. The Lord has not called you like a woman forsaken and faint-hearted, nor like a wife hated from her youth, says your God. I forsook you for a short while, but with great compassion I will have mercy on you. Servile and unstable, you were not comforted. But behold, I am preparing you carbuncle for your stone and sapphire for your foundations. And I will make your battlements jasper and your gates crystal stones, and the enclosing wall of your temple choice stones. I will cause all your children to be taught by God, and your children to be in great peace. It's remarkable. It's a really beautiful text because, firstly, he's speaking in a way that is, it recognizes the dignity of the one who has not borne children. She is no less than anyone else. And just because, and he says this, he says, the kids of the woman who has many kids, so a lot of them are messed up. But your children, they are strong. It doesn't go into explanation like, what does that mean? Are these spiritual children? Are these, extended family? Because there are different relationships that can be included in this. That's the beauty of this text. Don't ever say that the prophets were somehow, inaccurate, or that they spoke in ways that was, not clear and concise. If it's not clear, there's a reason for it. We definitely need to look at it wider. But he does say, prepare yourself, make your home bigger, your space wider. And then he said, and the children that he will send, so they will be chosen stones. And this is what the fathers, when they read this, so, of course, anytime you've got that kind of a terminology of chosen, so it's like, okay, there's something there. Something is being concealed there. And so the chosen stones, at least in this context of the Old Testament, are the holy ones, the saints, the prophets, because the house that this woman has, be she interpreted as Israel or symbolically as wisdom, wisdom has built herself a house, or be she some humble Israelite woman who is struggling with infertility, these words still ring true, that she will have God's blessing. And she needs to have her heart oriented to God with that kind of an openness that he is working something for me. He is doing something that will take place in due time, whatever it is, be open. And then God says, of course, then that he will bless this individual, this, if it's Israel again, or if it's an individual woman, that he will bless her and she will have many blessings. So it's very much opposite to what became kind of the norm in expressing what happens. Now, as a little bit of a review, I want to go back to since we celebrated the Feast of the Nativity of the Mother of God, just want to briefly take a look at what happens with Joachim and Anna. And we take this from the Proto-Evangelion of James, of St. James. And it begins with, the statement about Anna and Joachim, who were well-to-do, who lived in the Holy City. Their home was close to the temple in Jerusalem. And because of that, Joachim was able to go to the temple every day and pray. And at one point, an upstart young priest at the temple, realizing that Joachim does not have kids. And this is, what does this reveal? Well, it reveals that somebody went up to this guy and told him, hey, do you know that Joachim has no kids? And they've been married a long time. And so there's gossip. There are people who are already imposing their negative assessment on Joachim and Anna, that somehow they're not good. Somehow God doesn't like them. And so he tells him, this priest, we're told his name is Rubim. He tells him, it is not proper for you first to bring your offerings, because you have not made seed in Israel. So you have not contributed to the growing of the people of Israel. And it says that Joachim was extremely saddened, and he left. And he went away, and he told some of the other people who were there that he was going to search the story of the people of Israel and find someone else who went through the very same thing that he did, of not having a child, and that God still favored him. And so in his search, he brought up the patriarch Abraham, and then found out that in his old age, God gave him a son. And so Joachim became sad again, and he decided to go to the desert. And in the desert, so the Proto-Evangelion says that he went there to pray, but he fasted. He did not eat or drink. And his terms were that he would not leave the desert or eat or drink until the Lord my God shall look upon me. So basically, it's a biblical way of saying he was depressed and was probably going to die there. This was a tragic place to be, and what he was doing would contribute to his eventual death. Anna went through some of the same things. She, in her prayer, she specifically speaks about her two lamentations, her two mournings. She says, I shall bewail my widowhood, because she knows what Joachim is up to. He is trying to die, and if that happens, she's a widow. I shall bewail my childlessness. And she struggles with it. She struggles, and she tries to keep a positive approach, a good face. But then her servant gives her, out of pity, gives her a little handmade trinket so that it might bring her a little bit of joy, and that kind of pushes her over the edge. And so she accuses the servant of giving her something that is wicked, that it is like a talisman or something that is not, it's not a good luck charm, because she's still in this double mournfulness of widowhood and childlessness. And so the servant tells her, why should I curse you, seeing that the Lord has shut your womb so as not to give you fruit in Israel? So her servant actually insulted her to her face. Because and this is something we see in the Old Testament too, that the women who are barren are not respected. and that very often others in their circle, specifically women, because that was, in that society, women were with women and men were with men. So, but they, eventually hear words that are rather harsh. And it is then that she kicks out her servant and she puts on her most festive clothes and she goes into the garden. And it is there that God speaks to her. And then he informs her also that he has already gone to send his angel to Joachim to tell him that they shall have a child. Now it's interesting too, one of the little details here is that these writings tend to be poetic on different levels. So it's not poetry that rhymes. It's not, you don't read this like a Hallmark card, but there are ideas that are kind of reflected. And so as Joachim searched for an Old Testament model and came to Abram or Abraham and then was disappointed, so too Anna prays and she asks, God of our fathers, bless me, hear my prayer, as you blessed the womb of Sarah and gave her a son, Isaac. That both of them have come to the same couple. And so it's kind of beautiful because Anna finds consolation in the story of Sarah, and Joachim finds condemnation in the story of Abraham. And it's interesting how differently you could almost say, and this is one of the reasons why in the early church and in many of the Eastern churches, so the feast of the conception of Mary is actually the conception by Saint Anne. So it reflects some of that understanding that the pregnancy is on Anne, but it also shows a certain it sheds light on Anna and her awareness, that somehow her faith was more informed, and her faith, despite the challenges and difficulties, never took her quite to that same dark place as Joachim. Could say that it's her faith that kind of carries both of them. Because after all, in the Proto-Evangelion, we don't hear about the angel going to Joachim. We hear about the angel going to Saint Anne. So that couple has their own history. But then we also hear about, and I guess we should probably, good idea to take a look at some of the Old Testament figures. And there are two realities to kind of remember. So infertility is a problem. It is definitely a challenge. It has always been a problem. So this is not something that is isolated to today or in the Old Testament, just one of, the ways that God dealt with humanity. It's always been challenging, just as having a child has been challenging. And so remember that in the time of the Old Testament, the estimate in generically speaking, so we could say kind of the average, because there were worse times and there were better times. But sociologists and historians, generally speaking, there was a 50% birth rate. So you take only half of the children conceived were born. then out of that, probably another 50% of those who were born died by the age of 5. So this is the reality up to Jesus's time. Now, yes, this is a theory. This is, not something that we can base on science, because those statistics are not there for the collecting, as we do today when we go to the computer and we just look things up. But these are kind of like, historically speaking, what was the general state of health and reproduction among the people of Israel. Now, there will be nations that have a higher birth rate and a lower mortality rate. And there will be other nations that will have a lower birth rate and a higher mortality rate. So there are differences between the people of Israel, the Egyptians, the ancient Chinese. I mean, every culture and nation will have something different in their own statistics. So that being said and done, the way that we look at this biblically, just as I had mentioned before, is that ultimately God is the bestower of life. And so he is the one who gives fecundity, and he is the one who decrees when one is not able to have a child. So there are, that's the biblical approach. But that being said and done, it still doesn't mean that we can get a very beautiful image of the struggles. Now, beautiful, maybe that's not the word to use, but we can get a clear image of the struggles of these couples and families and individuals who dealt with infertility. The first one that I would like to look at is Sarai. Sarai, who when she gets pregnant, and she would become known as Sarah, just like Abram would become known as Abraham. So Sarah deals, and when we read her story in Genesis, so we get a very clear idea of the struggles that she is dealing with. We see in her personality unbelief, impatience, anger, and even disrespect. A lifetime of infertility has literally pushed her over the edge. And this is not something which is simply, conjecture, but she is dealing with a reality that unfortunately has taken her from being the wife of Abram to being secondary because she cannot produce an heir to him or for him. And so Abram prays, and he prays for her. He says, "O Lord God, what will you give me? For I continue childless. Behold, you have given me no offspring, and a member of my household will be my heir." And the Lord said to him, "This man shall not be your heir, but your very own son shall be your heir." Now, Sarai gets this news from Abram, and you must imagine what she was thinking when she hears that they're going to have a child, especially since her family life has become very confusing. And she's already at that point where she knows she's physically unable to have a child. So she has passed the age of childbearing. And because of that situation, Sarai gave to Abraham, she offered to him her female Egyptian servant, whose name was Hagar. And so Hagar was able to give a child to Abram. And this for Sarai, and you can imagine what kind of an emotional reaction a woman of faith would have. You know, feeling completely abandoned. And then once her servant Hagar, who was, you know, for her servant would be a confidant. So these were not like slaves that you would beat. I mean, it was slavery, but they very often became intimate to the family. In this case, her servant became a part of the family by producing an heir for Abram. But then the worst part of it, when Hagar conceived, she lost respect for Sarai. We read that in Genesis chapter 16. She looked with contempt on her mistress. Sarai must have felt that God was excluding her from his plans, because after all, here was Abram who was so intent on having a relationship with the Lord God of Israel, who was trying to live in faith, and yet he was not going to have this child, and not by her. And here instead, a slave girl would be the one who would provide that for her own husband. And so there is, you can imagine that not only is there unbelief, lack of faith, but there's also anger. Abram said to Sarai, "Behold, your servant is in your power. Do to her as you please." And Sarai dealt with her harshly, and she fled from her. So the relationship, even with the servant, became difficult, not only from the part of Hagar, but also from the part of Sarai. Now, after all this, and you could say this is kind of a low point. For Sarai, for sure, this is a low point, because there are other things that I'm sure she was thinking of. For example, when she is older, you know, she was already mature, but when she is older, so, and the son of Hagar will be the heir, what will he do to her? Will he dump her, exclude her, get rid of her? You know, so and because of all of this anger within their family, it could only get worse. That's when God comes. Kind of a pattern. Joachim and Anna, very similar. When you see kind of you're at the bottom of the ditch, the Lord appears to Abraham and promises that Sarah would bear a child. And here, let me share this from Genesis. Then God appeared to him at the oak of Mamre, as he was sitting in the tent door during the noon hour. He lifted his eyes and looked, and behold, 3 men stood before him. The Holy Trinity, right there. And when he saw them, he ran to the tent door to meet them and bowed himself to the ground and said, "O Lord, if I have now found grace in your sight, do not pass by your servant." This is really cool, because he just sees 3, but he only addresses them as one. Okay, so it's a prefiguration of the Trinity. that somehow Abraham knows something. O Lord, if I have now found grace in your sight, do not pass by your servant. Let water be brought, and let them wash your feet, while you cool yourselves under the tree. And I will bring bread for you to eat. After that, you may pass by, inasmuch as you have come to your servant. They said, do as you have said. So Abraham hurried into the tent to Sarah and said, quickly make ready 3 measures of fine meal, knead it, and make it cakes. Then Abraham ran to the herd, took a young calf, tender and good, gave it to his servant, and he hastened to prepare it. He also took butter and milk, and the calf he prepared, and set it before them, and he stood by them under the tree as they ate. Then he said to him, so he is God. Then he said to Abraham, where is Sarah, your wife? He replied, here in the tent. Again, he said, I will certainly return to you according to the time of life. And behold, Sarah, your wife, shall have a son. Sarah was listening in the tent door behind him. Now Abraham and Sarah were old, well advanced in age, and Sarah had passed the age of childbearing. Therefore, Sarah laughed within herself, saying, I have not yet had a child until now, and my Lord is also old. My Lord, she's talking about her husband. Is anything impossible with God? At the appointed time, I will return to you according to the time of life, and Sarah shall have a son. So God says it again. But Sarah denied she had laughed, for she was afraid, saying, I did not laugh. But he said, no, but you did laugh. So it's beautiful that God is showing, I mean, we're seeing quite a bit of who God is in this interaction. But it's this beautiful moment in this story where God has answered the prayers. And now, because of this, Abraham would become the father of many nations. Now, this isn't stating, at least if you're reading Genesis, it's very clear that Abraham and Sarah, or Abram and Sarai, were not perfect people. Their relationship was a good, solid relationship that suffered under this experience of infertility. But it was through their trials, through their tribulations, that they would become a part of the plan of God. So it's not as simple as one would like to think. And that humanity, the anger, the emotions that are there, all of that is an essential part of this. Because I think sometimes, it's easy to kind of read the Bible in a more glossed over version where we kind of don't read between the lines. And, it's almost like if you take the Bible stories and go to like a children's Bible, where it is glossed over, where all of the angst and all of that stuff is covered up. But that's not the real experience, because the experience of God is not a perfect experience. for God or for us, the humans are always going to be dealing with struggles. And those questions about, where are you, God? Why aren't you helping me? I'm trying to be good. I'm trying to do things as you want me to do, but I'm just not seeing you in the fruits of these struggles. So it's a common experience what they went through, even though, it's specific to their infertility. But a lot of the emotions are emotions that we have also in our struggles, in our relationship with God. Now, with Abraham and Sarah, this question and struggle of infertility seems to continue in the generations that come after them. So it's not just about Abraham and Sarah, but we also come to Rebecca. Rebecca, who is the wife of Isaac, who is the son of Abraham and Sarah. We hear also about some of the circumstances. So Isaac was 40 years old when he married Rebecca. 20 years later, when Isaac was 60, they had twins. So there was 20 years of no children. We don't read as much like with Sarah, so we get a lot about her emotional state in the text of Genesis. When it comes to Rebecca, so we don't get as much information about her emotions. But it's reasonable to assume that both Isaac and Rebecca wanted to have children sooner than 20 years later. And we do know that Isaac does pray God in the name of his wife because she was barren. And that prayer is ultimately what brings Rebecca to conceive. So when Esau and Jacob were born, Isaac and Rebecca's problems didn't completely disappear because there were still other problems in their marriage, including heartache, betrayal, and confusion. So there are still issues in their relationship. But Rebecca's son Jacob would be the one who would be the foundational family, could say kind of the first family of the people of Israel, because from his children would come the 12 tribes of Israel. However, Jacob and Leah and Rachel, they had a lot of problems. And this is where things get really dicey. This is the stuff that you could use for a soap opera. So Jacob was in love with Rachel. But Rachel's father was trying to get Leah, Rachel's sister, married off. And so he tricked Jacob into marrying Leah. And with Leah, so there was some problem, I don't know, you could say like she wasn't the pretty sister or something like that. There are different words that are used about her, and they say something about, they call her like that in one of the Talmudic texts, they call her Leah with soft eyes. And it's like, what does that even mean? And so some people say maybe she was partially blind, but there was something that, her father had to get involved to get her married. So, and it had to be done through deception. So that says something about, well, firstly, the family that Jacob is marrying into. But then again, they're also related. So it's not, it's not a close relationship, but the father is like an uncle of Jacob's, so there is there are a few issues. Let's put it that way. Leave it at that. So in order to get married to Rachel, Jacob had to work for his future father-in-law for 7 years. When he did that, he was permitted to marry Rachel, who turned out to be Leah. Now, because the situation was that you could have a few wives at this time, so he asked for Rachel because he was in love with her. And so he asked if he could marry her. And so he had to work another 7 years. And ironically, Leah has children with him, and Rachel does not. And the interpretation that the Midrash gives us on this is that because it's like the question is, how could God be so cruel? Where he would let this happen to the one who would be the father of the 12 tribes. How could he have him suffer because he loved, and then he ended up with a bad deal? And so the interpretation, the Jewish interpretation, says that because Leah did not have the love of her husband, God gave her children so that they would love her. Because her husband only loved Rachel. So, and conversely, and Rachel couldn't have children. So it's kind of, this is actually the way that it's worded. When the Lord saw that Leah was hated, he opened her womb, but Rachel was barren. Leah conceived and bore a son. Now, eventually, Rachel does have a child, but her story is a tragic story because she bears 2 sons for Jacob. The sons are Joseph, who is hated by his brothers and ends up being sold into slavery and ends up in Egypt. And then Benjamin. And Benjamin is the child that is born of her, and Rachel dies in childbirth. And so Benjamin then becomes, for his father Jacob, as it says in the Bible, the apple of his eye. He becomes the favorite child. And interestingly enough, if you remember back to the story, and this is where everybody knows Joseph and the Technicolor Dreamcoat, and then it's also popular in children's books. So in children's books, we get kind of a little more of a sanitized version of it, but there was jealousy. The brothers were brothers not only by Leah, but also by 2 servant girls. One servant girl that was of Leah and one servant girl that was of Rachel. And so all of these siblings, they were jealous of Joseph and Benjamin because, well, he Jacob loved their mother. So obviously those would be his favorite children. It was kind of a human, you could say, natural. I mean, you're supposed to love all your children and stuff, but come on, let's be real. Uh, there's always a favorite child out there when it comes to families. It's like, yeah, and all mothers who say no, they're just lying. It's like, but and it's not a bad thing. It's bad when it becomes excessive, but there's going to be the child that you get along with more, that has certain qualities. You just click, you connect. So it's not a bad thing. But here the motivation was true love versus lies and trickery, and that's hard. It's like, well, okay, Leah had a bunch of kids. She also gave Jacob his only daughter, Dima. So, there's all of that. And you say, well, I guess they got over their problems because they sure had a bunch of kids after that. But it's like they had children because that's what they're supposed to do. That's like, you have to have children. That's a part of the arrangement. And so, but that didn't mean that that Jacob forgot the fact that Leah was in cahoots with her father to trick him against Rachel, the love of his life. So I think this would make a great movie. This is really good stuff. And, so when it says in the Bible like that, she was hated, we don't know who hated her. Was it Rachel? Was it her husband? Was it Jacob? But we don't know. You can only kind of imagine who it might be. And it might be both of them. Now, there are other emotions that must have been there. Imagine Rachel, who has just seen the love of her life married off through trickery to her sister Leah. And then, she ends up as part of this trade-off of he needs to work for her father, his father-in-law, for 7 years so that he could, after 7 years and some children, now marry the love of his life, Rachel. So emotions such as anger and envy, they had to be a part of that life. Now, when finally she does have her children are even, you could even see that they're somehow focused upon, like especially Joseph becomes such an important part of the salvation of the people of Israel. That little nucleus of a tribe that was just beginning to form, had they been left in the desolate, land where there was drought going on and everything was dying, even the animals and the plants, that they would have probably died out as a nation. And so the fact that through Rachel, we get this figure of Joseph, and Joseph brings the people to life. And Joseph also, out of there is no tribe of Joseph. So with the 12 tribes of Israel, it's like, okay, well, why doesn't he have his own? After all, if he's the best of the brothers, he should have his own tribe. Well, that's because he got two. So from him, his two sons became two different tribes of the people of Israel, Ephraim and Manasseh. So, it's, think about it too, that these figures like Joseph is a messianic image. because he saves the people of Israel from a certain death. Moses, figure also like the Messiah, he saves the people of Israel from a religious and cultural death. They might not have died in Egypt, but they were on their way to being absorbed into the Egyptian population. And so that's why they were then prone to worship cows and calves and stuff like that. So, I one little footnote, just this is great Bible trivial pursuit knowledge, but the name Rachel, it means you, like a lamb, you. And Leah means cow. So not even a calf. Poor Leah. Even by her name, she's got problems. But again, this is another story which is triumphant despite the pain and the suffering and the anguish. There is still this redemption that comes about that is not necessarily there because of the people didn't come to some conclusion that this is how things are going to work. I think you could say, and this is going to sound a little cheap, but you can say, well, love wins. That definitely there is something to be said about their commitment to each other. And but there is also, and I guess you could still say that through all of that adversity and that emotionally charged reality, God always comes through. He's always faithful. He's always there, even at that moment, at those times when things are so confusing. Now, there's one more woman that I'd like to bring up, and this is Hannah. Now, the fathers of the church, they compare Hannah to her namesake, Anna. Hannah and Anna are the same name. And so her story is in some way similar to Joachim and Anna. And many who read the story of Hannah come to the conclusion that there's a lot of detail in there. There is a lot that we would call emotionally charged words. So there isn't something to, it's not mysterious, it's not lacking for description. But we hear that Hannah weeps very often. She doesn't eat. Her heart bears her sadness. She was deeply distressed, and she tried to make deals with God. And these are all aspects of what we would refer to as depression. This is clinical. This is not something which is unknown to us today. And one can say very honestly that yes, a woman who is dealing with infertility in this way is going to be going through such emotions and others besides. And there is also another reality that happens to Hannah. Her husband, Elkanah, so he takes a second wife, Peninnah. And Peninnah, as sometimes happens, Peninnah, when she gets pregnant, she lords it over Hannah. So she actually adds to her emotional distress and to her heartache. Similar to Leah, Peninnah has some of the same qualities. Peninnah and Leah were secondary wives. They were viewed ultimately, even Jacob looked at her in a utilitarian way. That's why they had kids. It wasn't because of love. Peninnah was the same for Elkanah. She was also just a means to an end, that he would be able to have children. So there are similarities there between Leah and Peninnah. But there are also similarities between Rachel and Hannah. Both women could not conceive, and in both cases, their husband's love wasn't enough to heal the depression, the sadness, and the heartache. So it's interesting how these things, we see them again and again, because they are a shared experience. And, Hannah is not a descendant of Jacob, but she shares in that same pain. And there is also, then we can make the comparison then between Hannah and Anna and Joachim and Elkanah, because these were loving couples. They did not have between them bad words or conflict. They were exemplary. They were couples that inspired other couples. But eventually, when she does conceive, she promises her child, who is the prophet Samuel, she promises him to the service of God from the time he can walk, which is exactly what Anna does with Mary. Anna actually goes and she wants to take the baby almost immediately to the temple. Instead of, you would think that now she's got the baby, that she's going to want to hang on to her and spoil her, and everything. She's fully aware that God has heard her prayers. I mean, he sent an angel. So this child has some role. Hannah has that same clarity. She knows that this child is for God. And so she has this joy in motherhood, but she doesn't need the attachment to the child because she's already attached enough. And she's primarily attached to God, who has heard her prayer. So it's a beautiful parallel. And it's interesting because, we can connect all of these individuals, both men and women, through the Old Testament and New Testament, and we can connect them and make a psychological profile. But I think what's important is that we also look at the profile in faith, because these difficulties were overcome with faith, with love. And that's something which is, I think, really an important message. And this is when we look also at like the lives of the Ulma family, that in their martyrdom, it was faith and love that kept them together and made sure that they would be able to act in faith, with faith, and knowing that whatever happened, and they knew, because in Poland, that was the thing. If you were sheltering Jews, death was the death penalty for both the Jews as well as those who were sheltering them. They knew that. But they also knew that they could not live in faith and just be silent, let those things happen. So now there are other women in the Old Testament, such as Ruth, the wife of Manoah, and the Shunammite woman. The Shunammite woman is the woman in the story of Elisha. And when she has the child, Elisha brings the child back to life when the child dies. So little, and I'm not going to go into great detail with this because that's something that you can look up. They're secondary figures, so they're not as important as the ones we've discussed this evening. But it is ultimately this is the story of pain that has been used for good. And that brings us to our final couple. And the couple is Elizabeth and Zachariah. Now, they're portrayed in the gospel tradition very clearly as faithful followers of the law, good Jews. And Zechariah is a priest in the temple. Both Zechariah and Elizabeth are descendants of Aaron. And Aaron was Israel's first high priest. Priesthood is by blood. So that means all the priests who serve in the temple are descendants of Aaron. So for Elizabeth, being a descendant of Aaron, it was important because it rendered their child, you could say, pure in his service as priest. Of course, we know that John did not serve in the temple. But John's service of preparing the way in the desert still had a certain connection to the temple. One of the things that happens at the temple or in pilgrimage to the temple is that people get ritually washed in the mikvah, in the Jewish ritual bath. And so what John was doing, a lot of people didn't want to go to the temple to be washed because it was a racket. At that point, a lot of the people in charge of the temple and temple treasury were also paying money to the Romans who were occupying. And they were paying for positions. And so, by the time that John was baptizing, so Elizabeth and Zachariah were already dead. And so he wasn't doing something that would put him in conflict with his father's service in the temple. We're told that Zechariah was killed in the temple in Jerusalem by the soldiers of King Herod, who was looking for the Messiah after the three kings ditched him, the wise men rather, after they ditched him and went back to their land, their native land. He came out with a vengeance looking for this child, and and he was told that one of the priests at the temple had a child who would be that age. And so he had his soldiers question Zechariah, and Zechariah said that yes, he had a child who was born in that period of time that the Messiah was born, but that he was not taking care of him, that he was gone. And John was already in the desert with his mother, hiding in a cave. And so the soldiers executed Zechariah there at the temple. So that is the tradition that has been preserved in the church. How accurate it is historically, we don't really know. A lot of the records from that time aren't preserved. However, in Jewish sources, there is preserved the story of a high priest who was killed in the temple at the time of Herod the Great, and his name is Zechariah. So that appears in Jewish sources. So it could very well be the same person. Herod was a nutcase, so I mean, he went around killing quite a few people. So there might have been multiple, but nonetheless, that is kind of where that tradition comes from. Now, with Elizabeth and Zachariah, their reality is very similar to Sarah and Abraham. They are already advanced in age. Even the angel says that. And so that you can take that as meaning biologically, it is not possible for them to have children anymore. So, although some would say, well, maybe she was in her 40s, or I mean, I don't think it's that important as far as age. She could have been older than that. But the reality is that this was, again, an answer to prayers. Now, we don't hear too much about Elizabeth's state of mind, her emotional state of mind. But after having listened to the stories from the Old Testament and knowing Joachim and Anna, so we can deduce that not having children was a big deal. And I'm sure Zechariah also had some of his, fellow priests who were like, great that you're like pure, you're all Aaron and this, and your wife is from Aaron and stuff, but, you don't have kids. So I'm sure he took a lot of abuse, a lot of flack for that. But ultimately, he was permitted to continue serving in the temple. And I guess I want to also kind of bring this up just as a kind of a biblical footnote, that a priest who would be known to be unable to have a child, so either some horrible accident that caused disfiguration, but he was not able to have a child. So he was, because they didn't have tests to figure out if he was sterile or not. But a priest who was known to not be able to have children could not serve in the temple. So again, all the blame was put on Elizabeth. So Zechariah was permitted to serve in the temple because he was thought to, not be the problem. Now, in their story, the focus is on Zechariah. And, when you read this in the Gospel of Luke, it's also important to read it when you read the Annunciation, because the intention of Luke is doing the parallel thing. So he is paralleling the Annunciation to Mary and the Annunciation to Zechariah. Completely intentional. With Mary, it's a whole different thing. There's nothing about being sterile. There's nothing about barrenness. But what does come there is that the ability to have a child comes from God. And so that she's pregnant, that's from God. So the same is then true for Elizabeth and Zechariah. The interesting thing, though, is that Zechariah, who is, priestly caste by blood, did all of the preparation, has put in many years of service at the temple in the presence of God. He has studied, he's been formed. His father, his grandfather were priests at the temple. So he knows all of this scripture, he knows all the prayers, things by heart that have been taught him from when he could first walk. So, and of course, serving in the temple, he's also seen miracles because stuff happens when you're in the presence of God. And right there in the Holy of Holies is the place where the people called it, that was the footstool of heaven. So it didn't contain God's presence like that, but it was a place where God touched the earth. And so inside are all of the things that the people of Israel have kept as proof of their relationship, their unique relationship with God. And so it has the Ark of the Covenant that contains the tablets of the law, the manna that rained on the people of Israel. It contains the rod of Aaron. And all of these things are there because they are part of the presence of God. They are the proof. They are the items that, in a way, connect the people to God who is in the heavens. So entering that place, that's pretty daunting. According to tradition, there was but one entryway into the Holy of Holies. The people who came to the temple to pray, so out inside the main room before the Holy of Holies, there were altars there and priests there who would take the offerings that were brought. And a part of these offerings would be blessed and taken into the Holy of Holies. Other offerings would be taken by the priest families. Other offerings would be given back to the people who had offered them. And, that's specifically talking about animals that were sacrificed there. And so the people could not enter into the Holy of Holies. They couldn't even see into it. They just came to a wall. And on the other side of the wall, they knew that's where the presence was. And that was the Holy of Holies. And so only the high priests could enter in, and they would enter in during specific times of day. So he was there to offer incense, which was what happens in the evening. And we still do that in the evening when the sun sets and you serve Vespers, for example. So the first act is the offering of incense. The second act is the lighting of lights, which is exactly what used to happen at the temple and in the Holy of Holies. And so Zechariah goes in. This door that he enters is a half door, which means he has to enter on his knees. So crawling in. And he would have around his waist, a rope would be tied so that in case he was unworthy and burned up there or died in the presence of God, they could still fish out his body. Remember that scene from Raiders of the Lost Ark? It's real. So that was the understanding. Now, of course, for the person who is going in, he has gone through a mega retreat. He has prayed for 40 days. He has fasted. He has not seen his family or anyone who would render him like impure. So he would have been living at the temple in quarters that were for the priests who were being prepared to go in to serve. And it wasn't just like a regular schedule of services. They would draw lots. Now there were thousands of priests, so that means you weren't like on a rotation, but you would serve in the temple maybe a handful of times in your lifetime. Now, there were many other things that priests did, but going into the Holy of Holies, that was the high point, the pinnacle. And so, and if you're going to do this, so kind of presuppose that you have to have a little bit of faith. and believe in miracles and know that, if you're going into the presence of God, there's bound to be an angel or a million. And so he goes in there. The angel speaks to him and tells him the good news. And he does what every high priest should not do. He questions the angel because he has a doubt in the presence of God at the footstool of heaven. Yeah, it's pretty rough. So he who is like steeped in faith at that, crack that second, the doubt just comes in. And everything that he's learned and studied and lived, all of that kind of falls to the back. And so that's unfortunately why he gets punished then and is unable to speak. Now, Luke wants us to compare this to Mary, because there, Mary has a similar reaction, but it's not doubt. She questions based on certain realities she knows. So she doesn't say, it's about the movement of the heart. With Mary, who is not steeped in that same heritage as Zechariah, who has not seen miracles at the temple, who although she is raised in great faith, she is a simple girl. And she has a different understanding, but she does not have doubt. And that's why, like Zachariah and Elizabeth, their story could be told in the New Testament, comparing it to like one of the Old Testament stories, because there are a lot of little details that do connect. But Luke wants us to really appreciate the annunciations of both of these individuals, of Mary and Zachariah, of a young girl and a very old man, and someone who has a life lived in faith and someone who is a miracle child with faith. And yet ultimately see that God works through both. That despite this great doubt expressed in the presence of the angel in the presence of God, he still had John with Elizabeth, who would be the greatest man born of woman, and the prophet, the voice in the desert. So it's like, it's almost a way of saying, well, if you do have doubts, it's okay. Just get through them, work it out, figure it out. But, doubting is okay. And in the Old Testament, we see a whole myriad of other emotions that are also okay, because they're part of the redemption. It's through the suffering, through the emotional chaos, that there is salvation, that there is hope, that there is life. So it's an interesting topic. It's not as sad, because it can be a sad reality, especially for people who are going through that today. But there is also this beautiful assurance that God is with us through this, that God helps us, that God is still calling us. So even for the mother, echoing those words of Isaiah, rejoice, barren one. There is always hope. God is always calling. So although some of the things come out as like, curses and stuff like that, that's not the mind of God. That's unfortunately the way we see things. And, and we see a lot of that. We see a lot of that kind of a condemnation, a judginess. People are so eager to uh, to bear judgment against somebody because of this or that, and Jesus warned us. He said, hey, don't be talking about somebody else's splinter if you got a plank in your eye. And it's that's a might be a bit excessive, but we see a lot of that. It still happens. And and I think one of the things to remember is, we have some of the greatest saints through the greatest tragedies and sadnesses, and again, think about the Olmas, whose martyrdom, although it's tragic and sad and even recent, their witness is so beautiful and strong. So that's my 2 cents for this evening. Any questions?
Your mother was freed from barrenness, and your father from the loss of speech. And the incarnation of the Son of God is proclaimed to the world.
Yeah, baptism by blood. Essentially, because it's martyrdom, the baby's own blood. Because that life it's a sacrifice to God, just as all the other martyrs. There was, if you remember, a few years ago, there was the case of the Coptic Christians who were executed on the shores of Tripoli in Libya. And so among those Christians, there was one man who was from sub-Saharan Africa. So he was not Egyptian, he was not Coptic, and he was also not a Christian. But he was so moved by the witness of the Copts, of the Coptic Christians, that he went with them. And so, and his is another case of a martyr by blood. They were actually added to the church, the Roman Catholic Church's martyrology. So there are feasts that are not like celebrated, but they're on the calendar, and so their feast, the Coptic martyrs, was added by Pope Francis onto the calendar, I think, last year.
Your mother was freed from barrenness, and your father from the loss of speech. And the incarnation of the Son of God is proclaimed to the world.
Well, in the email, I also gave the dates for the next ones in October, November, and December. So it's gonna be once a month, because here there is more to do in person, and thank God we're at a good point where we can do that. So, and I am very bad at doing like the hybrid stuff where it's like, people here and then online. I cannot do that. I will wander off and not come back. So you're welcome. And at the beginning of October, I'll send out the next theme. Still working on kind of whittling that down a little bit. I'm also open to suggestions, so don't hesitate to let me know. And the next webinar will be on October 18th. Okay? You're welcome. Have a great evening.